Then a bus full of Israeli tourists is blown up somewhere in Europe, and it's pinned back to Hezbollah or Iran. Or there's another popular uprising in Iran, which is crushed by the Iranian regime. And Congress decides to introduce new sanctions against Iran. They're non-nuclear related, but Iran replies by saying, you've abrogated your end of the deal because you've reintroduced new sanctions, so we're going to recommence our nuclear activities. I mean, is that something that, I've spoken to people at the White House, they say this is something that certainly does concern them down the road, but do you see this as some critics of the deal are concerned that Congress would be forced to exercise restraint for fear of abrogating the deal? Is that, how do you see that scenario playing out?
Well, my intention is to observe the letter of the agreement. And the administration has been very clear that there is absolutely nothing in this agreement that, A, removes the existing sanctions that are applied to Iran by the United States with respect to human rights abuses or support for terrorism, or removes from Congress the ability to apply new sanctions. And there is nothing that would allow Iran to walk away from this agreement should there be sanctions applied in the future to non-nuclear activity. And so I'm not going to live in fear of Iran violating this agreement simply because their behavior crosses a tripwire that causes us to have to engage in a new conversation about sanctions. And I wouldn't support this deal if I thought that it was committing me to a policy of essentially standing down on Iran's behavior in the region. And frankly, I think it's important for us to make that clear. If Iran thinks that this is a get-out-of-jail-free card for their support for terrorism in the region or ratcheting up human rights abuses internally, then it's not a deal worth signing, as far as I'm concerned, from our perspective. I don't deny that that's going to be a complicated question, but at the outset, I'm certainly not going to concede that this would render Congress's ability to increase sanctions for other reasons impotent.
And in your remarks, I think you very articulately raised this question about a challenge that the United States has in the Middle East, which is this conflict oftentimes between our interests and our values. Some of our allies in the region not sharing those values. And I was just wondering if you find this to be, you've been in Congress almost 10 years now, is this a moment in which many members are now raising these questions about who are our real allies in the region, what are our interests? Because for about 4 decades, it was pretty consistent. There was a template that, we had cooperation with Saudi Arabia and containment/conflict with Iran. Is this, are you one data point, or are there many data points, sir?
I think there's a more robust conversation happening about our balance of friendships in the region, and it's made necessary by a region that is more unstable today, a region in which our named enemies now have more power and more impact in the region. And of course, much of this is a result of American activity. Much of this new balance of power in the region, which requires us to think about a new balance of friendship and alliance, is because of an Iraq war that has set off a series of local catastrophes. But I actually don't concede that this is just a question of balancing values versus interests. I appreciate the long historic alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia. But this hasn't just been a question of American values being out of step with what's happening in Saudi Arabia. I would argue that our interests also have not been properly aligned. I mean, the money that flows into Saudi Arabia and back out to Wahhabi clerics, to extremist madrasas all throughout the region are not in alignment with American interests. And so, yes, there is this distortion of what we say about our values and what we do when we are so closely aligned with a country with that kind of human rights record. But there is also a question as to whether it has been in our historic interest to align ourselves so closely with a set of countries that very quietly fuel money, much of it American money that comes there through oil purchase, to extremist Islamic groups that end up organizing against the United States and many of our other allies. So I think this is not just a question of realigning our values, it also is a question of whether there's a conversation that's necessary about realigning our interests.
Let me go back to Iran for a second, because there's a debate in Washington about why Iran decided to sign this deal, why Iran finally compromised. And it's between those who argue that it was simply because of economic duress, the combination of sanctions, the drop in oil prices, and the money, the billions they're spending, sustaining the Assad regime. And there are those who argue that moderates or pragmatists in Tehran have decided to pursue a fundamental shift, a fundamental break with the last 3-4 decades of Iranian history. What is your reading of why Iran decided to compromise?
So I'm hopeful that this is the presage for a longer-term transition of power within the country to younger, more moderate forces. But I don't presuppose that the reason for this, for them entering into this agreement, is because the shift is happening under our feet as we speak. I think this is a recognition on behalf of the supreme leader that this election, the election of Rouhani, signaled a degree of unrest that he had to answer. And so his way of answering it is to allow for this negotiation to take place, releasing economic pressure on the country. And I think you just have to, listen, I don't ever put too much stock into the statements of the supreme leader. I think we've seen in the context of this negotiation that what he says does not always match with the policies as we saw in these talks. But you saw what he just said in the last few days, that there is nothing about this agreement that is going to change the fact that the United States is still, in their eyes, the great Satan, that we are that we will be in opposition to their interests in the region for the foreseeable future. And the hardliners don't go away. In fact, they are going to try harder than ever to try to make themselves relevant. And I don't likely believe that there's any fundamental shift that happens in the short term.
And my final question before handing it over to all of you, the U.S. and Cuba normalized relations just in the last week. And I'm curious to get your sense of what would need to happen before the United States and Iran normalize relations. I mean, there was an interest section, U.S. interest section in Havana for about 3 decades before this normalization, before it turned into an embassy. Right. We don't even have an interest section yet in Tehran. But for yourself and other members of Congress, what would you need to see change in Iranian behavior to start to advocate for normalization of relations?
Well, I think first and foremost, you would need to see a complete change in their disposition towards terrorist groups in the region. And again, as I said in my answer to the previous question, I don't see that happening anytime soon. I don't think that there is a conversation that is going to happen in Washington about the normalization of relations with Iran anytime soon. A lot has to change. Our bar for normalization of relations is not normally domestic human rights, but I think you would also want to see some progress on that as well. I don't think that's a conversation that happens anytime soon. But, of course, this question of formal diplomatic relations is, maybe an overplayed distinction. We are going to talk to the Iranians in the wake of this agreement. We may not have an embassy in Tehran. We may often do it in multilateral forums or through partners. But there is a channel now that exists. And, part of what I was trying to say in these remarks is that it's a channel that's important, especially in a destabilized region where there may be limited opportunities for us to cooperate with Iran on taking on common enemies.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'll hand it over to all of you. Maybe there's going to be so many questions. I'll take 2 at once, and we can bunch them together. If you can just identify yourself and be as brief as possible right there, please.
Daniel Serwer from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Senator, you know me as a Balkans expert, but I spent 7 years abroad doing non-proliferation work as an American diplomat. One thing I would never want to do is try to prevent proliferation in a country where I had no diplomatic presence. So the question becomes not formal diplomatic relations, but the kind of informal or less than full diplomatic relations that we did have with Cuba for a long time that served our purposes very well. Don't we need that in Tehran?
And I spotted here Greg Craig, who was President Obama's first White House counsel and former head of policy planning at State Department, most importantly, former member of the Carnegie Board. So I wanted to pick on him for a second.
Morning, Greg.
Morning, Senator. First of all, let me thank you for your remarks. I thought they were terrific. And I'm particularly grateful for your dealing with the windfall argument that is being made against the argument, against the agreement. I have two concerns that I wonder if you might comfort me about. My first concern is that this debate that we're about to have is not on the level. You pointed out correctly, I think, that there were many, many critics of the agreement that had their talking points all ready to go in press releases and pushed the send button without ever looking at the text or the content of the agreement. We have the example of the 47 senators already writing a letter to the Supreme Leader raising concerns about the agreement. And there are those of us who think that the likelihood of one Republican vote, either in the House or the Senate, for this particular agreement is very, very slim. Do you think that this debate that's going to occur is in fact going to be a legitimate and thoughtful debate comparable to the remarks you gave us, or is it going to be driven by party line politics and just the drive to beat Obama? That's my first question. My second concern has to do with the leadership of those who ultimately will be supporting this agreement. There are hundreds of diplomats that have signed letters, nuclear experts that have signed letters in support, and some of us are concerned that the leadership, the senior leadership of the Democratic Party, either in the Senate and the House, have been absent in supporting and reacting to the presentation of the administration. We've had one senior Democrat saying the jury's still out. We have one aspirant for the leadership of the Democratic Party in the Senate who is publicly uncertain about how he is going to vote on this, but still wants to be the leader of the Democratic caucus. So there's concerns not only about the critics having a legitimate debate, but about the ultimate supporters being strong enough to defend this agreement in the Senate.
I think those are all great points. So I was admittedly not a supporter of the Corker congressional approval legislation. I ended up voting for it because it got significantly watered down to the point that it became largely benign. But I was a fairly vocal opponent of it through 95% of the process until it got changed at the last minute for the exact reason that you stated in your first question. I just didn't believe that this was ultimately going to be a fair, on-the-level, dispassionate, nonpartisan debate. I thought that by handing over to Congress the power to approve something that we do not have a constitutional obligation to approve, a Congress that was controlled by opponents of the president, you were essentially politicizing a debate that didn't need to be politicized. And I think Republicans have largely proved that to be true in their vitriol that came spewing forth within hours of the agreement being signed. I'm not so fatalistic as to the question of whether there will be any Republicans who will support it. I have had quiet conversations with a handful of Republican senators who are very worried about the entirety of the party getting on the wrong side of this agreement. And I think the polls will shift over time, maybe backwards and forwards on this, but consistently they have shown that the American public, granted with very little knowledge of the details of the agreement, support it, most recently in a Washington Post poll by 20 points. As to your second question, here's the trap that we're in. So we are appropriately critical of Republicans who have come out and lambasted the deal without considering it. That means, though, that we have to take the time to consider it before we come out as fulsome vocal supporters of it. And so for the time being, there is this imbalance in rhetoric. Republicans just incessantly attacking the deal, and Democrats supporting it, as I generally did today, without completely endorsing it because we feel like we, at the very least, have to go to tonight's classified briefing and sit through at least one official hearing before we come out and support. And so I think there will be a time. That's a long way of saying that I think we are in a period of misalignment of rhetoric that will be corrected.